What do the songs Baby One More Time, I Want It That Way, and Bang Bang all have in common? Aside from the not so subtle, spicy lyrical content,
a little bit spicy,
these mega hits also share the distinction of being the brainchild of the same man, the legendary and elusive music producer Max Martin. In fact, he's so elusive that I bet you didn't notice that that isn't Max Martin. This is. Just kidding, that isn't him either. This is. Max has dominated the pop world for almost 3 decades, scoring over 75 top 10 hits in the Billboard charts, with 25 of them reaching the top spot, putting him third in a list of songwriters with the most #1 singles, behind these two kind of famous guys. But unlike Timbaland, who really wanted you to know when he produced the song, Max Martin has preferred to lurk in the shadows, never appearing alongside artists and rarely doing interviews. But how did one man from a small village in Sweden take over the world with his music? And why does barely anyone know his name? To answer those questions, we need to go back to where it all began, to the 1970s. Max Martin, whose real name is Carl Martin Sandberg, was born in a suburb of Stockholm in 1971. He was interested in music from a young age, learning the French horn and drums, before settling on singing. But as a teenager, he was not interested in the glossy pop music he would eventually be known for, and instead liked to listen to his brother's Kiss cassettes. This inspired him to join a glam rock band called It's Alive, who achieved minor success and got signed to Cheiron Records, headed by the aptly named producer Dennis Pop. It's Alive eventually disbanded, but this experience would change Martin's life in 2 very important ways. Firstly, he developed his singing skills, which would be crucial during his career, as we'll see later. And secondly, Dennis Pop recognized Martin's talent for songwriting and asked him to come and help him produce pop songs for Cheiron. Martin, who was going by the stage name Martin White at the time, had no idea what he was doing and spent a couple of years learning the craft, before finally getting his first co-production credit with the song This Is The Way by E-Type in 1994, but was shocked to see that his name had been changed to Max Martin by Dennis Pop, who said that his previous name wasn't exactly disco enough. The duo continued to work on moderately successful albums by acts like Ace of Base and 3T featuring Michael Jackson's nephews, but around the same time, they had been contacted by a young vocal group from Orlando, Florida, and it was this collaboration that would truly change the landscape of pop music forever and propel Max Martin to new heights. Backstreet Boys burst onto the scene with their self-titled album in 1996, containing the Max Martin produced singles Quit Playing Games With My Heart and We've Got It Going On, and became one of the most successful debut albums of all time. Max said that he thought he was making R&B music, but due to his European upbringing and a different set of musical influences as a result of that, he ended up creating an entirely unique sound altogether. A second album was released a year later, and their most successful album Millennium a couple of years after that, with Max Martin producing their insanely popular singles such as I Want It That Way, Everybody, Show Me the Meaning of Being Lonely, and As Long As You Love Me. While Backstreet Boys were not the first boy band ever, their success ushered in the most boy band dominated era in history, with acts such as NSYNC, Westlife, 98 Degrees, and Five. Looking to further capitalize on this trend, Lou Pearlman, who was the manager of NSYNC and Backstreet Boys at the time, and later got sued by both groups for cheating them out of their royalties, wanted to start up a girl band, and started auditioning for members with the help of Justin Timberlake's mother. She suggested a young singer from Louisiana named Britney Spears, who had been on a Disney show alongside her son. Pearlman was impressed, and when Britney ultimately decided not to join the band to follow a solo career instead, Max was hired to produce a handful of songs for her debut album. The lead single Baby One More Time came to Max as he was drifting to sleep one night, humming ideas into the dictaphone he kept by his bed. When he woke up and listened to it the next day, he was surprised to find out that he still thought it was a good idea, unlike most of the ideas that came to him in a half-asleep state. And he later turned it into a proper demo, including all the vocal tracks. Max's time in his glam rock band came in extremely handy, as he was able to record himself doing the guide track to show the singer exactly how to sing it. As John Seabrook, author of the book The Song Machine, puts it, in a sense, everyone is singing covers of Max Martin recordings. Upon release, Baby One More Time became an instant worldwide hit, making Britney a star overnight and bagging Max his first #1 hit on the Billboard charts. Max had changed the sound of pop music and had also racked up 12 top 10 hits in a mere 5 years. But unfortunately, halfway through this meteoric rise, he was hit by tragedy as Dennis Pop passed away from stomach cancer at the young age of 35. A couple of years later, Max closed Cheiron Studios and opened his own studio called Maratone, named after Dennis's favorite game, Marathon. Soon after, there was another death. This time, the death of teen pop and boy bands. Pop music was changing. Max's sound had become dated, and he worked on very few tracks between the years of 2001 and 2003, with no top 10 hits among them. He knew that he had to reinvent himself, and he had a few tricks up his sleeve. There's a theory by radio program director Guy Zapolion that mainstream music works in roughly 10-year cycles. Pop music will enjoy a peak of several years, until the public grows tired of the sound du jour and starts heading towards what he calls the extremes, like rock and hip-hop, in search of an edgier sound. It then ends with the Doldrums, a phase where the edgy music becomes softer and popularity of mainstream music declines even further until new fresh ideas come along and mark the start of a new cycle. The early 2000s were a perfect example of the extremes phase, with the rise of acts like Eminem, Jay-Z, Nelly, and 50 Cent taking hip-hop to new heights, as well as the garage rock revival movement spearheaded by The Strokes, The White Stripes, and The Hives. Hip-hop lent itself more to producers who were also songwriters, and we saw fresh talent like Pharrell and Timbaland rise through the ranks to produce hit after hit, eating into the pie that had belonged entirely to Max just a couple of years earlier. Max decided to move to New York City for a while, in order to be closer to the culture that was producing these hits, as well as give him new inspiration so that he could break out of his rut. When he first arrived, his daughter got chickenpox, and he was confined to his hotel room for 2 weeks. So he decided to learn how to play the guitar in the hope that it would allow him to approach songwriting in a different way instead of using patterns he was used to on his keyboard. One night at a house party, he met a man named Lukáš Gottwald, aka Dr. Luke, who was the lead guitarist in the Saturday Night Live band at the time and who'd been dabbling in production. Dr. Luke gave Max a tour of the nightclubs in New York, and the two struck up a friendship. He was also listening to a lot of new music around this time, and one song in particular caught his ear. The song Maps by Yeah Yeah Yeahs. Max was intrigued by the sound and the atmosphere in the song, but was frustrated by the chorus, which he saw as too tame and a missed opportunity. Dr. Luke started spending all his time in Max's studio in Sweden, only flying back to New York to do his SNL gig and then flying straight back. The duo decided to make a version of Maps, but with the chorus turned up to 10, and then eventually pitched it to Pink, who turned it down, and Hilary Duff, who had trouble hitting the high notes. The song, called Since You've Been Gone, eventually went to Kelly Clarkson, and although both parties thought that it wasn't the right match, it ended up on her second album and became a mega hit and Max's first top 10 hit in 4 years. It was also his first plunge into more guitar-y pop rock music, showing the world that he was ready to adapt to the changing musical landscape. They continued to produce predominantly guitar-driven pop songs for the likes of Pink and Avril Lavigne in the years that followed, but only got a couple of top 10s with Pink in the 3 years after Since You've Been Gone. What they really needed was a fresh face, someone who could come in, take the music world by storm, and pull mainstream music out of the doldrums, putting pop music back on the throne. They needed their Britney. As we entered into the second half of the 2000s, the dominant genre was still hip-hop, but we started to get a few breakout hits from more electronic genres like electro house and new disco, and that filtered through to pop music, with Madonna's album Confessions on a Dance Floor and Britney Spears' Blackout showing a more electronic direction. In 2008, Lady Gaga emerged and continued this trend with influential tracks like Just Dance and Poker Face. In the meantime, a girl named Katie Hudson had spent the early 2000s making a Christian music album. She later decided to switch to secular music, but got dropped by 2 labels before releasing an album, and rebranded herself to Katy Perry, before finally getting a deal for what would become her proper debut, One of the Boys. The label wanted to add some smash hits, so they put our 2 boys back on the case, and they delivered with I Kissed a Girl and Hot and Cold. They then went on to produce a significant number of tracks for her second album, Teenage Dream, with no less than 5 #1 hits, with Perry becoming the first woman ever to achieve this and the second artist overall, following Michael Jackson's album Bad. They had finally found their Britney. Max's collaboration with Dr. Luke had finally paid off, and Max's status as a serial hitmaker had been cemented once more. The music on these albums wasn't exactly electropop, but more and more Max was starting to incorporate synths taken from the dance music scene into his music. And after the huge rise of EDM in the early 2010s, we started to see more and more electronic elements in his music, perhaps most prominently on his work with Ariana Grande. But at the same time, he went on to achieve huge success with the likes of Taylor Swift, The Weeknd, and more recently even Coldplay, writing pop songs that sound more like his usual fare. He also started working more with a range of young songwriting talent around this time, which might explain the bigger range of sounds in his songs from 2010 onwards. So in his latest era, he's been able to blend elements from his first two eras, while also adding more electronic elements to fit the trends in music, and still writing songs that fit an existing artist's style. This is truly Max in his final form. While he's still continuing to write and produce songs to this day, he did take on a little side project in 2019 in the form of musical theatre, helping to produce a show that centers around his songs and tells the story of an alternate reality version of Romeo and Juliet, in which Juliet hasn't died. But despite all this success, Max is still unknown to the majority of people, even as they sing along to his perfectly crafted melodies on their way to work or on a night out. So why isn't he plastered on the cover of every pop culture magazine, appearing as a guest on all the biggest podcasts, or as universally known as the Beatles? Well, it may be to do with something called Jantelagen. Jantelagen, which means the law of Jante, is a fictional set of rules from the book A Fugitive Crosses His Tracks by Axel Sandemos. The crux of Jantelagen is to avoid thinking and expressing that you are better than others, and that general mindset is quite prevalent in the Nordic countries, often known for having more egalitarian societies. This seems to have also seeped into Max's approach to life. He doesn't crave fame, and he doesn't want to be recognized as some genius songwriter, without which the careers of all of these superstars wouldn't be possible. To him, the pop star lifestyle is hugely uncomfortable, having to market yourself in 1001 ways and always be front and center, while also being exposed to the psychological perils of fame. He's a self-confessed nerdy studio dweller, and he says he instead prefers to stay in the background, away from all the attention that interviews and social media would bring him, as that leads to a simpler life without as many worries. He attributes this in part to Prince, who was famously mysterious, and is perhaps Max's way of saying that the music should do the talking and grab all the headlines, rather than his personal life. And, in keeping with Jantelagen, he's always very quick to say that things were collaborative, and he often gives praise to the writers and artists that he works with. I have to say that for one of the most successful and influential musicians of all time, it's impressive how his mega success and giant net worth hasn't gone to his head, and he has stayed humble. There is, however, a group of people that not only know Max very well, but are also likely to take over from him when he finally decides to hang up his boots. The Disciples. Max has been assembling great songwriters around him ever since he took over Sharon from Dennis Pop, and they've mostly been Swedes, but in 2011, he decided to expand what was then Maratone Studios into the US, with 2 songwriting and production shops filled with teams of songwriters, MXM in New York, and Wolf Cousins in Los Angeles. Let's talk about a few key personnel. Perhaps the first of Max's proteges, and the one that's all over the credits of Max's early songs, is a man named Rami Yacoub, who caught Max's attention due to a song that had become popular in Sweden. His very first production credit was on Baby One More Time, which is just an unbelievable way to hit the ground running. And he later went on to do a lot of Britney's next album and NSYNC's albums, as well as Lady Gaga, Ariana Grande, and others, after he parted ways with Maratone in 2008. We've already spoken about one of Max's other collaborators, Dr. Luke. The duo enjoyed a very successful 10 years, co-writing 21 top 10 hits and 10 number ones, and Dr. Luke was instrumental in Max's resurgence with a guitar-led sound after the collapse of boy bands and teenage pop in the early 2000s. A number of Dr. Luke's songs, including ones written with Max, were accused of plagiarism, with the most famous one being Katy Perry's Dark Horse, which the rapper Flame said sounded like his song Joyful Noise, and filed a lawsuit. Dr. Luke was also sued in 2014 by Kesha for a variety of abuse-related accusations, and probably a combination of these two things meant that he was banned from the MXM collective. In 2001, a friend of Max's was sending him some death metal demos by a young kid named Johann Schuster that made him wonder what it would sound like if Johann were to write pop music. So recreating his own origin story, he invited Johann a few years later to his studio to work on some pop songs, and soon hired him as a full-time songwriter. Because, well, why not pick someone who reminds you of you? Johann Schuster now works under the name Shellback and has written 10 number 1 singles for the likes of Pink, Taylor Swift, and Maroon 5. Ilya Salmanzadeh and Savan Kotecha, who's one of the few non-Swedes, are also significant proteges, coming to prominence in Max's third era and most notable for making Ariana Grande into Ariana Grande. So, just as Dennis Pop took Max Martin under his wing and turned him into the hit factory he is, Max is doing his best to pass the baton onto a whole roster of songwriters and producers that will no doubt carry his musical fingerprint into the future of pop music. But of course, the man himself is not done yet. As of 2023, he's still going strong. And earlier in the year, Madonna shared a picture of her with Max from the studio, working on what will presumably be her next album, and broke the internet. While the rest of us are left wondering what more Max wants to achieve, whether it's passing Paul McCartney in the top songwriters chart or earning more money, I suspect it's something much more simple and centered around his first love: making music. If you enjoyed this video, then you should probably check out this other video over here that you might like. I'll see you next time on Mixed Signals. Bye bye.